She painted the dry ground white, while everyone laughed. 5 years later, the drought spoke for her. Sarah Mitchell had her knee on the cracked ground when the first laughter reached her. It wasn't from far away. It was close. It was the kind of laughter that hurts more than any word, because it comes from those who should, at the very least, keep their mouths shut. She kept on brushing. The whitewash spread across the broken earth as if it were paint on a wound, and she knew it looked like madness. But she also knew deep down, where certainties need no explanation, that it wasn't. It had started 3 weeks before, when the reservoir dried up for good. It didn't happen all at once, that. It happened slowly, with the cruelty of things that leave without warning. First the water level dropped, then the mud appeared along the edges, then the mud cracked. Then the ground became hard as baked clay, white underneath and brown on top, and the November sun beat down on it as if to make sure nothing was left. 3 years of drought in a row, one after another, without a break. And now, the reservoir, which was the heart of that small community of farmers scattered across the dry slopes, had finally gone. It was that same night, after seeing the bottom of the reservoir bare for the first time in her life, that Sarah opened the tin box she kept under her bed. It was an old box, with the paint peeling off the lid and the bottom dented. Inside were her grandfather's notes, Arthur Mitchell, a county extension agent who had spent over 30 years studying soil behavior in the Badlands. Folded pages, yellowed with age, in the small slanted handwriting of someone who wrote quickly to keep up with his thoughts. Sarah knew those pages by heart. She had read and reread them since she was a girl, sitting on the old man's lap, listening to him explain in the measured voice of someone who knows time will prove him right. One of the notes described something her grandfather called reflective protection. The idea was simple. Paint the exposed soil of a dry reservoir with whitewash, creating a surface that reflected the sun's heat instead of absorbing it. This reduced moisture loss from evaporation in the deeper soil layers, preserving the water that still remained buried deep, out of sight, but present. Her grandfather had tested the technique on a small scale at a neighboring property decades ago. The results had been recorded, but never taken seriously by anyone but him. After he passed away, those pages stayed in the tin box, sleeping. Sarah stayed up all night rereading her grandfather's notes. When the sun rose, she had already made up her mind. She grabbed the widest brush from the shed, found 2 old buckets, bought whitewash from Hank's general store, where Mr. Otis Thompson looked at her with a face that said he didn't know whether to ask or let it be. She didn't wait for any question. She went through the gate, down the dry slope, and knelt in the middle of the reservoir while the sun was still low before the heat set in. That was when Mr. Otis Thompson showed up. Her father-in-law was 68 years old and walked with his arms almost always crossed, as if it were a posture he had adopted so long ago that he no longer even noticed it. He was a tall man, with broad shoulders that age had slightly stooped, wearing a leather hat that Sarah had known him in for as long as she could remember, and that he'd probably worn long before that. Sun-creased skin, a face of few words, eyes that weighed more than most people could bear for long. He stood at the edge of the reservoir, arms crossed, hat on his head, and looked at his daughter-in-law kneeling on the ground painting. He didn't say anything right away, but the way he stood there said a lot. The neighbors started showing up one by one. Mrs. Gladys Miller, from the property next door, leaned against the dried-up wooden fence with her hands on her hips. Her son, Wade Miller, stopped behind his mother with his thumbs hooked into his belt. Old Silas, who had worked alongside Sarah's grandfather for many years, but that nobody remembered anymore, kept his distance, quiet, watching differently from the others. "He's finally lost his mind," said Mrs. Gladys Miller, not under her breath. It was one of those statements delivered at a volume meant to reach its intended ears. Wade Miller let out a short, reluctant laugh, more out of social reflex than genuine amusement. Others echoed it. "The reservoir painter," someone murmured. And the nickname stuck with the swiftness of that cruel type of thing the Badlands knows how to do so well. Sarah heard it all. The brush didn't stop. There was something in that gesture of carrying on that wasn't stubbornness, at least not just that. It was a form of faith she couldn't explain in words, but felt in her knees pressed against the cracked ground, in her lime-stained fingers, in the sweat streaming down her neck inside her red blouse. It was the faith of someone taught by a person they truly believed in. Grandfather Arthur had died when she was 18. But before that, in his final years, when he had grown quieter and more given to long conversations on the porch, he had called her over many times to sit beside him and read through his notes together. She had never understood why he chose her among all the grandchildren. Later she realized, the others didn't listen. She did. "Sarah," he would say, his voice already hoarse but steady, "the Badlands aren't anyone's enemy. The Badlands are stubborn because the people here learned to be. But it holds water. You just need to know where to look." She had stored those words away like someone keeping something valuable, without knowing exactly when they'd need it. Now she knew. The second day of painting was quieter. The neighbors had lost interest in laughing and returned to their own problems, which were plenty. The drought spared no one. The livestock were thin, the fields had yielded almost nothing in the last cycle, and debts were piling up with the patience of things that collect slowly, but collect all the same. Only Mr. Otis Thompson kept showing up. Every day at the same time he stood at the edge of the reservoir with his arms crossed, watching, not out of curiosity, with something Sarah couldn't quite name, but that bothered her more than Mrs. Gladys Miller's laughter. Sarah's husband, James, was 36 years old and had the same quiet demeanor as his father, but with a gentleness his father either didn't have or didn't show. They had gotten married 8 years ago. Back when the land still yielded and the reservoir was still full, they had 2 young children, Caleb, 6, and Daisy, 4, who roamed the property with that carefree freedom only young children have, not really understanding the scale of the problem around them. James had stayed out of the reservoir business at first, not because he openly disagreed, but because he didn't know what to say, and his silence was too heavy to be neutral. Sarah noticed this at dinner, when he chewed slowly without lifting his eyes from his plate, or when she talked about her grandfather's notes, and he nodded without asking anything. It was on the 4th night that things came to a head. They were in the kitchen after the children had gone to sleep. The lamplight flickered with the wind coming through the window crack. James was sitting with his hands wrapped around his glass of water, and Sarah could tell he wanted to speak before he even opened his mouth. "My father came to see me today," he said. "I know," she replied. He goes there every day. He said you're becoming a laughingstock around the area, that people are making fun." "I hear them," she said simply. James looked up for the first time. There was a tension in him she recognized, that effort of someone trying to say something difficult in a way that wouldn't hurt more than necessary. "I don't want people talking about you like that, Sarah." "So, what would you rather I do, stay home and watch the reservoir turn to dust?" "I'd rather you—" He paused. "I don't know. But this thing you're doing, there's no way it'll work. My father said your granddad had these ideas, and they never got off the ground." "Mr. Otis Thompson hasn't read a single line of my grandfather's notes," she said, her voice coming out firmer than she intended. James looked back down at his glass. They stayed quiet for a while, a silence that felt longer than it was. "I just don't want you to get hurt any more than the drought's already hurting you," he said finally, softly. She looked at him. There was genuine affection in it, she knew that, but there was also the weight of her father, of the neighbors, of the whole community with their stares and their comments. And there was, buried deep down, a doubt she understood because she carried it herself. What if her grandfather was wrong? What if it really was madness? But she went to sleep without promising anything. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. The next morning, Sarah went back to the reservoir earlier than on other days. The sun was still low and orange when she knelt on the white earth and continued her work. So far, she had covered a strip of ground maybe 50 feet long by 6 feet wide. It was nothing compared to the size of the reservoir, which was nearly 650 feet across. But she wasn't thinking about the size of the reservoir. She was thinking about what her grandfather had written, that the start was always small, and that whoever waited for the perfect moment to begin never started at all. It was that morning that the notes fell. She had put the old paper notebook in her pants pocket, folded, sewn into an improvised cloth pouch she'd made herself to protect the pages. The habit of carrying the notebook with her came from her grandfather's time. He always said that knowledge kept at home is knowledge forgotten. But when she stood up to get more lime from the bucket and bent her knee awkwardly, the pouch slipped out of her pocket and fell to the ground. She didn't notice right away. She went to get the bucket, came back, and when she looked at the ground, she saw the scattered pages, some of them open, with her grandfather's handwriting exposed to the early morning sun. Mr. Otis Thompson was there. He had arrived without her hearing him, as always. And he was closer than usual because he had come a bit farther down the slope that day, as if the usual distance wasn't satisfying something in him anymore. When the pages fell, he was the one who bent down first to pick them up. Sarah stood still with the bucket in her hand, watching. Her father-in-law carefully gathered the pages, straightened out the ones that had folded. And before handing them back, without her asking or expecting it, he read. He didn't pretend he hadn't. He stood there with the pages in his hand, looking at the lines written by the man he had never taken seriously. His face didn't change, but his eyes lingered too long for it to be a quick read. Then he folded the pages, handed them back to her without a word, and climbed back up the slope with his usual stride. Sarah watched his back until he disappeared behind the fence. That night, Mr. Otis Thompson didn't sleep. She didn't know that at the time. She found out later, when James told her that his father had stayed on the porch until dawn, something he hadn't done since the time James's mother was sick. The father-in-law sat in the leather chair that had belonged to his own grandfather on a hot November night, staring at the dark field. Silas, the old man who had worked with Sarah's grandfather, went looking for Mr. Otis Thompson the next day. They had known each other for a long time, but they weren't close. Silas was a 72-year-old man, thin as a rail, with a slow voice that had the rhythm of someone who had learned to wait. He had seen the notes fall and had stayed back, watching, without interfering. "Otis," said Silas, leaning on the wooden fence on the other side. "I worked 8 years alongside Arthur Mitchell." Mr. Otis Thompson looked at him. "The man wasn't crazy," Silas continued. "He was ahead of his time. There's a difference." Mr. Otis Thompson didn't reply, but he also didn't turn his back, which was already something. Meanwhile, in another part of the region, a name began to circulate for reasons that had nothing to do with painting the reservoir. Mr. Sterling Vance was a rancher from a town 2 days away, a businessman with land in 4 different counties, and for months he had been sending a representative named Grant to tour the properties of that community with a briefcase and a notepad. The offer was always the same: buy the land at the current price, which was low because of the drought, with a promise of cash payment. Mr. Sterling Vance knew the drought would pass. It always did. And when it did, those lands would be worth 5 times what he was offering. It was a simple deal from his perspective. He took advantage of those in despair to buy what was worth much more. Grant had already closed deals with 2 families in the region. One had left at dawn with their bundles and children without saying goodbye to anyone, too ashamed to face the neighbors. The other had spent a month trying to reverse the agreement before realizing the paper they had signed offered no way out. Mr. Otis Thompson's property was the most coveted. It was in a strategic spot, with access to a spring that, even during the drought, still trickled. Grant had visited Mr. Otis Thompson twice. Both times, the old man had listened to the offer in silence and sent him away without a final answer, but also without refusing, and Grant took that as a positive sign. What he didn't know yet was that Mr. Otis Thompson was, at that very moment, replaying Arthur Mitchell's notes in his head. James Thompson heard about Grant's visit from one of the ranch hands working on his father's property. He came home with a grim face and told Sarah while washing his hands at the backyard spigot. "Did you know that man was visiting my father?" he asked. "I knew he was around the area," she said. "I didn't know he'd gotten to Mr. Otis Thompson's. My father didn't tell me anything." She dried her hands on her apron and looked at her husband. "James, if your father sells that land, we have nowhere to go. Our house is on his property." He knew that. That was why his face was grim. "I need to talk to him," said James. "Talk to him. But carefully. Your father doesn't like feeling like people are trying to decide for him." James went that night. He came back late. Sarah pretended to be asleep, but heard him come in, heard the noise of his shoes being taken off, heard the silence that came before he lay down. It was the silence of someone who hadn't had the conversation they needed to have. The next day, she woke up before everyone else and went to the reservoir. The work had progressed well. Almost a third of the reservoir's bottom was already covered in white. From a distance in that morning sun it looked like snow, and there was something disturbing and beautiful about that contrast, the clean white in the middle of that dead earth brown. Sarah looked at what she had done with the mix of fatigue and determination of someone who isn't measuring results yet, just doing. That's when she heard footsteps behind her and braced herself for another comment, like the ones Mrs. Gladys Miller usually made. But it was a young man she didn't recognize right away. He was about 25 years old, tall and thin, with that look of someone who had spent time in the city and come back with different eyes. Short hair, a plaid shirt open over a white t-shirt, hands in his pockets. "Are you the one painting the reservoirs?" he asked. "I am," she said, without looking up from her work. "I'm Owen Bennett, son of Mr. Barney Bennett, over on the other bank. I was in the city, but I came back because my father got sick." He paused. "I stopped by yesterday afternoon, but you'd already left. I watched you working." Sarah stopped painting and looked up at him. There was something in the way he looked at her work that was different from the way everyone else looked at it. There was no scorn. There was genuine curiosity. "What did you think?" she asked directly. "I thought it made sense," he said. "I studied 2 semesters of agronomy before I had to drop out because I couldn't afford it. The theory of reducing evaporation through reflection I saw in an old book in the college library. I've never seen anyone do it in practice." She stood still. She hadn't expected that answer. "So you know what this can do," she said. "I know what it can do in theory," he replied honestly. "In practice, it depends on the soil. How much moisture is still preserved in the deeper layers, how long the technique has to work before the next rain." "The next rain," she repeated with a joyless smile, "could be 2 years from now. Or it could be 2 months from now," he said. "This year the wind pattern is different. I heard it on the radio." Sarah looked at him for a moment. "Do you want to help?" she asked. Owen looked at the white ground, then at her, then back at the ground. "I've got a brush at home that's in better shape than that one," he said, and he left to go get it. Sarah watched his back with a heart a little lighter than it had been in recent days. Owen's arrival changed something in the community's dynamic, but not immediately. At first, the neighbors only included him in the jokes. "The rascal's become a little painter too," said Wade Miller, and laughed alone because no one else laughed along. But there was a difference between laughing at a woman alone and laughing at 2 adults working together with an air of knowing what they're doing. The joke became harder to sustain. Owen also brought something practical that was missing. He had his father's toolbox with old squeegees they adapted to cover more area per stroke. Sarah had been using a brush because that's all she had. With the squeegees, the work sped up. But Mr. Otis Thompson's property remained under threat. Grant came back for the 3rd time on a Wednesday afternoon with a new paper in his hand and a smile of someone who'd arrived with a done deal. Mr. Otis Thompson received him on the porch like the other times. But this time, there was something different in the old man's posture. He kept his hands on his knees without crossing his arms, which was unusual. Grant put the paper on the wooden table between them. "The price went up," he said. "Mr. Sterling Vance authorized an increase of 15% over the last offer. That's because you're a person who deserves respect, and we want you to leave well." Mr. Otis Thompson looked at the paper without picking it up. "Why did the price go up?" he asked in a flat voice. Grant blinked. The question was too good for an easy answer. "Because you've been here for many years, and that has value," said Grant, with the smile he had trained for these situations. "Did the value go up, or did what you want become clearer?" said Mr. Otis Thompson. Grant was quiet for a moment. "What time do you need me to give an answer?" the old man asked. "The sooner the better. Mr. Sterling Vance has other business in the region that—" "You come back next week," said Mr. Otis Thompson, standing up, "with the paper just the way it is now." Grant picked up the paper, folded it, and left without the smile. But what Mr. Otis Thompson didn't tell anyone is that same afternoon after Grant left, he went to the reservoir. It wasn't work time. Sarah and Owen had already gone. The reservoir was empty of people. Just the white on the cracked ground and the sun falling from the side, making those painted strips shine in a way that almost hurt the eyes. Mr. Otis Thompson went down the slope slowly, with the care that his 68 years now demanded on uneven ground. He walked along the edge of what had been painted. He stopped. He knelt, slowly, his knees protesting, and placed his open hand on the ground. On the white part, the soil was less hot than on the dark part beside it. It was a small difference, but a real one. He stayed on his knees for a while, his open hand on the earth, staring at nothing. Then he got up, shook off his hands, climbed the slope, and went to supper. He didn't say anything to anyone, but he didn't sleep well. The following week, 2 things happened at the same time, and each one pulled the situation in a different direction. The first was a discovery. Owen Bennett had left before sunrise to check an area they had painted over a week ago, the first strip Sarah had done alone before he arrived. He carried a thin piece of wood to probe the soil, something he had learned in his agronomy semester. He pushed the wood in slowly, feeling the earth's resistance. When he reached the first white strip, he probed as usual, and he stopped. The soil was different, not much, nothing dramatic. But there was a resistance down there that he didn't find in the surrounding soil, a resistance he recognized from when the earth still had something inside. Moisture, small but real, buried but present. He probed again. Same result. He ran to get Sarah. She came with her heart racing and knelt beside him. He placed her hand in the right spot, at the right depth. She closed her eyes for a moment. "Is it what I think it is?" she said. "It is," he replied, his voice low, as if unwilling to waste too many words on what he was feeling. They were silent for a while. The earth under her hand was cold, and cold meant damp, and damp meant that Grandpa Arthur had been right. She didn't cry, but she came close. The second thing that happened that week was less good. A young man named Colton Miller, son of Wade Miller, had overheard Grant's conversation with someone at Hank's General Store. The representative had commented in a voice not low enough that the goal was to close deals in the region before any news about that woman painting the reservoir reached bigger places and drew unwanted attention. Colton was a gossip by nature, but that particular piece of gossip he told to his mother, who told the neighbor next door, and the neighbor next door was Mrs. Hattie, who had been cleaning Mr. Otis Thompson's house every week since the old man's wife had fallen ill. "Mrs." Hattie told Sarah on a Thursday afternoon, in a low voice while hanging laundry on the clothesline in the backyard. "The representative of that farmer said your work is messing up the purchases he's trying to make," Mrs. Hattie said, tilting her head as if she were talking about the weather. "It's drawing attention from other neighboring communities, and that complicates his business." Sarah clipped a sheet to the line and stood still, her hands on the rope. "How long have you known about this?" she asked. "Since last week," Mrs. Hattie said, looking ashamed for having taken longer than she should have. "I was afraid to meddle, but then I figured you deserved to know." "I sure did," Sarah said simply. Mrs. Hattie left, apologizing 3 more times. Sarah finished hanging the laundry alone, slowly, thinking. The farmer was seeing her as a problem. This meant that what she was doing mattered more than she had calculated, and that was both good and dangerous. She went to find Owen that afternoon. She told him what she had heard. He listened with his hands in his pockets, staring at the ground. "He's going to act faster," Owen said. "He'll put pressure on the families before word of the moisture discovery spreads." "We need people to know," said Sarah. "We need more than that," he said. "We need what we found to be documented, recorded, so it's not just our word." Sarah was quiet. "Remember I mentioned I had a document from my grandfather," she said slowly. Tobias looked up. "You said you carried his notes." "The notes, yes. But there's something I never really understood." She paused. "My grandfather told me he registered the method at the clerk's office decades ago. It was part of a community project he was trying to formalize. I always thought it was just an old man trying to make what he did sound important. But now—" Tobias stared at her. "Do you have the document?" I have a copy, she said. It was always inside the box with the notes. I never knew what to do with it. I didn't understand what it meant. Show it to Silas, said Tobias without hesitating. He knew your grandfather. If anyone knows what that paper means, it's him. Sarah went home thinking. At night, after putting the kids to bed, she opened the tin box under the bed. At the bottom, beneath everything, there was a brown envelope sealed with tape that had lost its color. She opened it carefully. Inside was a folded paper with the header of a clerk's office and her grandfather's signature. The date was over 40 years ago. The text described, in formal terms, the soil recovery technique through caloric reflection, registering it as part of a community agricultural development project, developed by Arthur Mitchell, agricultural technician, for use on the lands of the farming community in that region. She read it 3 times. Then she put it back in the envelope and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, the paper in her hands. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, go ahead and leave a like, and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. The next morning, she went to Silas's house before breakfast. The old man had lived in a simple little house on the corner of the family property for years, an only child who stayed while the others left. He had a cactus garden that he cared for more dearly than anything else alive around him, and he was watering one of the pots when Sarah arrived. Silas, she said without preamble, you knew my grandfather well. I did, he said without stopping watering. 8 years side by side. Do you know about the registration he made at the clerk's office? Silas stopped watering. He looked at her in a way she didn't expect. It was the look of someone who had been waiting for that question for a long time. I do, he said. Tell me what it means. He put the watering can on the ground, straightened his back slowly, and looked at her. Sit here, he said, pointing to the wooden bench in front of the little house. This is going to take a while. Sarah sat down. Silas explained that her grandfather Arthur had tried back then to formalize the technique as a community asset. The idea was that the method wouldn't belong to anyone individually, but would be recognized as the community's heritage, formally registered so that no person or outside interest could appropriate, modify, or suppress it. The project had been met with indifference by most at the time, but the registration had been done anyway. Your grandfather knew he was going to die before he saw the results, said Silas, with the calm of someone who accepts such things. But he also knew the paper would outlast him. What does this paper mean legally? Sarah asked. Silas made a cautious gesture. I'm not a lawyer, but I heard your grandfather explain it many times. If the technique was registered as a community project, any land where the technique was originally developed and documented falls into a legal gray area. It becomes harder to sell without consulting the community. Your grandfather did it on purpose, because even back then there were outside farmers trying to buy land here. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Do they know about it? She said. The farmer and his representative? They don't know you have the document, said Silas, but someone might have tipped them off that it exists. As if the word tipped had pulled something in the air, Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. I need to show this paper to someone who understands, she said. There's a young man at the county seat, said Silas, the son of Earl from the warehouse, who studied law. He's not a licensed lawyer, but he studied, and he's from around here. You can trust him. Sarah went the next day before anything else could happen. Earl's son was named Justin Harper. He was about 30 years old, glasses on the tip of his nose, and the manner of someone who reads a lot. She placed the document on the table in front of his house and waited while he read, rereading one part, then another. Where did you get this? He finally said. It's always been with me. My grandfather left it to me. Justin took off his glasses and looked at her. This is a formal record of communal use. It's not common, especially from the time it was made. Your grandfather was careful. He paused. This doesn't prevent individual land sales, but it creates an obligation to notify the community and opens the door for a challenge if the sale compromises the documented project. In a lawsuit, depending on the judge, this could hold up a process for months or years. Is it enough to stop the farmer from buying my father-in-law's property without the community knowing? She asked directly. Justin stopped. If the farmer knows this document exists and tried to suppress it, that changes the conversation completely, he said. Is someone trying to suppress it? Sarah thought of Grant, of the comment that had reached her through Mrs. Hattie. I have reason to believe so, she said. Justin put his glasses back on, folded the document carefully, and returned it to her. Keep this well hidden. Make a copy, and hide it in a separate place. He looked at her seriously. And let me know if anything strange happens with documents at the clerk's office in town. Sarah went home with the paper in her pocket and a heart both heavier and lighter at the same time. When she arrived, James Thompson was on the porch waiting. It wasn't the usual time for him to be home. Did something happen? She asked. Grant went to talk to my father again today, said James, his voice tense. My father told me. For the first time, he told me. Sarah climbed the porch steps and stood in front of her husband. What did your father say? That he didn't accept the offer. James paused. But he said he'll think about it until next week. Next week is too long, she said. I know, he said, but he's my father, Sarah. I can't. I know he's your father, she said, softer, but you need to talk to him, not to decide for him so he knows what we found out. The moisture in the soil, my grandfather's document, he needs to know everything before making any decision. James looked at her for a moment. You went to town? He asked, noticing something on her face. I did. And? My grandfather's document carries more weight than I imagined. She put her hand in her pocket, where the paper was like a reflex. And I think someone tried to make that paper disappear. James stood still. Tell me everything, he said. They stayed on the porch until it got dark. For the first time in a long while, the conversation between them had no heavy silence in the middle. It was the kind of conversation that flows from one topic to another without stopping, that goes back, that opens parentheses, that connects things. It was the conversation of two adults thinking together about a problem that belonged to both of them. When the children called from inside the house, James went first and came back with the two little ones in his arms. Caleb settled into his father's lap, and Daisy went to her mother's lap with the naturalness of children who don't grasp the gravity of things around them. Sarah held her tightly and breathed in the smell of her daughter's hair. That night, James went to his father's house. He stayed there for 2 hours. Sarah waited up without pretending she wasn't waiting. When he came back, she read the result on his face before he opened his mouth. It wasn't a resolution, it was progress. He listened, James said, heard everything, didn't say anything at the end, but he listened. That's something, she said. It is, he agreed. With my father, listening is more than half the battle. In the following days, something happened that neither of them had planned. The story of the dampness discovered in the painted soil began to spread. It wasn't Sarah who told it, nor Owen. It was Colton, the gossipy son of Wade Miller, who had passed by the reservoir that morning and seen the two of them kneeling on the ground with their hands open in the earth, and had asked what was going on. Owen, without thinking about the consequences, had explained simply what they had found. Colton went straight to Hank's general store with that news. Within 2 days, the story had reached 3 neighboring communities. In one of them, there was a group of farmers who had lost their own reservoir a year before and were in an even more desperate situation. 2 of them made the journey on foot to Sarah's property to see for themselves. She received them at the edge of the reservoir. They knelt on the ground with her and Owen, placed their hands on the white soil, and stayed quiet. How long does this take? Asked the older of the 2, a man around 50 with the tired face of someone carrying years of drought on his skin. My grandfather documented that the result appears between 10 and 15 days in the top layers, Sarah said. But the deep effect takes longer, months, and it depends on how much the soil still preserves underneath. Is it guaranteed? Asked the younger one. Sarah looked at him. Nothing in life is guaranteed, she said honestly. But the principle is solid. And here, on this strip we painted first, the result showed up. The 2 farmers looked at each other. Then they looked at her. We want to learn, said the older one. Sarah felt something in her chest that she couldn't quite name, but it had the warmth of that kind of thing that appears when a solitary effort finally finds company. They stayed for 2 days. She taught. Owen helped teach. And when they left, they carried the method in their heads and the determination of people who have found something to hold on to. The news of what was happening reached Grant through a channel he didn't expect. Mr. Otis Thompson himself from the general store, who had mentioned it in passing to a supplier from the county seat, who had mentioned it to someone else, and so on. Within 48 hours, Mr. Sterling Vance was calling Grant in a tone that Grant didn't like. "You told me that woman was a small problem," Sterling said. "She was," Grant said, defensive. "It was just her alone at first. And now there are people from 2 neighboring communities going there to learn her technique. Do you understand what that means? If this spreads, the narrative changes. People will stop selling because they'll think the drought has a solution." "The drought doesn't have a solution in 2 months," Grant said. "That doesn't matter. Their perception will change. And perception is worth more than reality when you're negotiating with desperate people." Sterling paused. "Go talk to her, in person, without paper, without a formal proposal. Go have a conversation." "With her?" Grant hesitated. "With her." Grant arrived at the reservoir on a Saturday afternoon, wearing dress pants and shoes that weren't suited for that terrain. Sarah was working when she saw him coming down the slope. Owen was on the other side of the reservoir and spotted the arrival from a distance. Grant stopped near her with a smile that was clearly professional. "Mrs. Mitchell," he said. "Yes," she said, without looking up from her work. "Can I say something?" he said, crouching a bit to seem less formal. "My boss heard about the work you're doing here. He was impressed. Real folks doing real things, that's what he said." Sarah stopped painting and looked him straight in the eye. "What do you want, Grant?" He blinked. He didn't expect her to know his name. "My boss is interested in supporting projects like this. There are resources available for soil recovery initiatives in the area." "What kind of support?" she said directly. "Financial, substantial." Grant spread his hands in a generous gesture. "In exchange, naturally, for a formal partnership, where the project would be tied to Mr. Sterling's name and resources." Sarah stared at him for a long enough time to be uncomfortable. "So he wants to put his name on it." "That's one way to put it," said Grant, still smiling. "Another way is that he wants to use what I'm doing to convince the community he's on their side, while he keeps buying their land for half the price." Grant's smile faded. "You can leave," said Sarah, turning her brush back to the ground. "Thanks for the visit." Grant stood still for a moment, clearly not used to that kind of rejection. Then he turned around and walked away, his dress shoes covered in white lime dust. Owen came from the other side with a serious face. "I heard part of it," he said. "So you know." "I do." He stood still. "They're going to try something else now." "I know," she said. The something else came faster than they expected. 2 days later, Justin came up to Sarah with a face she hadn't seen on him before. "I went to the clerk's office today," he said. "Just to be safe, I went to check your grandfather's deed." "And?" she said, feeling her stomach tighten. "Someone got there before me. They claimed the document had a date error and asked for it to be removed from the active registry while the date was verified." Sarah stood still. "Can they do that?" she asked. "They shouldn't be able to. But whoever went had a well-prepared technical argument, and the clerk on duty wasn't sure what to do. The document was temporarily suspended pending verification." Justin looked at her. "But you have the copy." "I do," she said. "I made one too." He pulled an envelope from his pocket. "And I took photos. Those copies are in different places." He paused. The one who went to the clerk's office was a hired lawyer. The hiring comes from outside the area, but it's not hard to guess from who. Sarah took the envelope. "What do we do now?" she said. "We wait a day," said Justin. "And tomorrow I go back there with the copies and a formal challenge to the suspension request. I have enough grounds to reverse this." She looked at him. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, not with suspicion, with genuine curiosity. Justin gave a small smile. "My father owns property here, and Mr. Sterling made him an offer last month." He closed his fingers on the folder. I know what that man is doing, and I know what that document represents. Sarah nodded. That night she told everything to James, every detail. Grant's visit to the reservoir, the attempt at the clerk's office, Justin's intervention. James listened with the concentration of someone putting together a puzzle while they hear it. He's going to try again, said James when she finished. He will, she agreed. This time with my father, he said, and there was a gravity in his voice that wasn't fear. It was determination. I need to talk to my father before Grant gets there. Go, she said, but tell him everything. Don't leave anything out to spare him. Your father is a grown man. He can handle it. James went that very night. The conversation between father and son lasted over 3 hours. Sarah stayed home with the kids, tidying up the kitchen and the bedroom, unable to keep still. Daisy went to bed early. Caleb stayed awake watching his mother until she took him to bed with a story she made up on the spot about a seed that grew all by itself in the desert until it found water. When James came back, his face looked different. He knew part of it, James said, sitting down in the kitchen chair. He knew Grant was a representative for an out-of-town rancher, but he didn't know about the clerk's office. He paused. When I told him, he turned red, not angry at me, ashamed that he'd almost given in. Sarah sat in the chair next to him. Is he going to turn down the offer? She asked. He did, right away. Told me to call Grant and say the property isn't for sale, never was, and never will be. James gave a tired smile. He said exactly that, word for word. She took a deep breath. And one more thing, James said, his voice slightly different. He asked if you'd be at the reservoir tomorrow morning. Sarah was quiet. Why did he ask? She said. He didn't say why, just asked. She went to bed unsure of what the next day would bring, but with something she hadn't felt so clearly in her chest in a long time. The feeling that the pieces of what she had started alone on the cracked ground were now moving on their own, in directions she could no longer control, and that maybe for that very reason were more real. The next morning she woke up in the dark and went to the reservoir. When she got there, the sun was rising from the wrong side of the sky, tinging the clouds an orange that looked like something out of a painting, and Mr. Otis Thompson was already there. He was on his knees on the ground, with a brush in his hand, painting. He wasn't looking at her. His eyes were on the ground with the concentration of someone doing something for the first time and not wanting to mess up. His leather hat on his head as always, his broad shoulders slightly hunched forward from the effort of a man nearly 70 years old who wasn't used to working in that position. Sarah stopped at the edge of the reservoir. Her heart did something she couldn't name. It was too big to fit into just one word. She walked down slowly, picked up the brush and bucket she had left there the day before, and went to work next to her father-in-law without saying a word. He didn't say anything either. They stayed like that for almost an hour, the two of them painting side by side, with the sun rising and the white spreading across the cracked ground as if they were writing something that didn't need words. It was Colton who took the picture. He had passed by chance, on his way to Hank's general store, and seen the scene from afar. He snapped the photo with his old cell phone without stopping, without announcing it, and kept walking. But the picture made the rounds, through the chain of messages that the countryside handles so well, in 4 neighboring communities before noon. The young man who had gone to fetch the brush 3 weeks earlier, now painting with the father-in-law, who had stood with his arms crossed at the edge of the reservoir. 2 generations kneeling on the same ground. In those neighboring communities, the picture did what no conversation had been able to do. It showed that it was possible, not just the technique, the stubbornness, the persistence of staying when the most sensible thing seemed to be to leave. In the days that followed, others came. First, 3 farmers from the nearest community, with old basins and old brushes and the look of people who don't have much hope, but also have nothing left to lose. Then 2 more from a more distant community, who had heard from someone who had heard from someone else. Wade Miller showed up unannounced one afternoon. He arrived with a small can of lime, stopped at the edge of the reservoir, looking at Sarah and his father, with an expression that mixed embarrassment and resolve. "Is there room for one more?" he said. Sarah looked at him. "There is," she said without any ceremony. He went down the slope, knelt, and began to paint. His mother, Mrs. Gladys Miller, who had been the first to laugh, found out later and stayed home without saying a word. Some defeats have to be swallowed in silence. Mr. Sterling Vance received the news of what was happening with a rage that Grant later described as the calmest he had ever seen, which was the scariest kind. The rancher stood still in his wide living room looking out the window and then said only one thing. "Go talk to her husband." Grant went. James Thompson received the visit on the porch with his arms crossed, which was unusual for him. Grant sat in the chair James pointed to and laid out the proposal as gently as he could. A sum of money, cash payment, in exchange for James convincing Sarah to give up her grandfather's document and accept a direct negotiation with Mr. Sterling Vance. James listened to everything. When Grant finished, there was a silence. "No," said James. Grant blinked. "I can increase the—" "No," James repeated. His voice was calm, but there was something in it that shut doors. "And if you come back here with any more proposals, I'll tell every neighbor of mine what you're trying to do." Grant stood up, picked up his briefcase, and left with the same white lime dust on his shoes as always. Mr. Otis Thompson was on his own porch when he saw Grant go through the gate. He saw James standing there watching the man leave, and his son, unaware of his father, lifted his head and took a deep breath with the posture of someone who had just done something he should have done a long time ago. The old man stayed on the porch for a while longer. Then he went inside. But before going in, he took off his hat and slowly ran his hand over the top of his head, which was the gesture he made when he needed a moment to swallow something big. The following days were unlike anything that had happened before. Justin Harper went back to the clerk's office with copies of the document and the formal challenge. The clerk, who this time had the chief present, accepted the challenge and registered the document back in its original condition. The technical argument of whoever had tried to suspend it was, as Justin had predicted, too weak to hold up against a formal challenge. Grant found out and notified Sterling. The rancher was silent for a while. "The document has been reinstated," said Grant. "I heard you," said Sterling. "What do we do?" Sterling stared out the window again. "Nothing," he finally said. Grant was surprised. "Nothing?" "For now," said Sterling. "Let the dust settle. I'll reassess the situation in a few months." What he didn't say, but what was true, was that the situation had gotten more complicated than he had calculated. The document, the copies, the lawyer in town, the united community, the attention from neighboring communities. It wasn't an environment that favored a forced purchase. He was a businessman, not one for a losing battle. In the community, no one knew Sterling had backed down. But Grant's absence in the following weeks was itself information. Sarah kept painting. The whole reservoir took another 2 months to be covered. 2 months of work, sometimes with many people, sometimes with few, sometimes with Mr. Otis Thompson by her side, sometimes with Owen Bennett, sometimes just her and the brush in the morning silence. Little Caleb Thompson, 6 years old, went to the reservoir one day and asked to help. She gave him a small brush and let him paint 1 square meter, which turned out uneven and blotchy. She didn't correct it. Her son was proud and talked about it for a week. James Thompson came to the reservoir for the first time one afternoon she didn't expect. He arrived with a bucket bought in town, went down without saying a word and knelt beside her. She looked at him sideways without speaking. He started painting without speaking. They stayed like that until the sun went down. "I should have come sooner," he said at last without lifting his eyes from the ground. "You came," she said. "Too late." "There was still time," she said, and there was so much in those 3 words that he fell silent out of respect. 3 months after the reservoir was completely covered, Owen left at dawn to do the routine probing that had become a habit. He took the thin wooden rod and went point by point, memorizing, comparing with what he had found in the previous weeks. When he reached the oldest part, the first strip painted by Sarah alone in that beginning, he stopped. He probed again, deeper, once, twice. He went to get Sarah. She came in the dark, still, stumbling a bit along the way. Owen guided her to the right spot, placed the rod in her hand and pointed to the place. She probed, stopped. "Owen," she said, in a voice he had never heard from her. "I know," he said. The moisture had risen. It was no longer that minimal thing from the first weeks. It was real, it was deep. It was the kind of thing you could feel even without any instrument. The soil was alive in a way it hadn't been for years. She knelt in the dark with the rod in her hand and said nothing more for a while. Owen stood beside her, also quiet. The first ray of sun was arriving when she finally stood up. She had dirt on her knees and fingers, and her eyes shining in a way that the dark still hid. "Now we call the other communities," she said. "Now we do," he agreed. The summons wasn't formal. It was the way things spread around there, by word of mouth, from yard to yard, by message over cell phones that caught a signal on the hilltop. In 3 days, representatives from 5 communities gathered at the edge of the reservoir on Mr. Otis Thompson's property. Sarah ended up in front without having planned to be in front. People simply organized themselves naturally around her, because that's what happened when someone had done what she had done. She explained what they had discovered. Owen added the probing numbers. Silas spoke about his grandfather's method with the authority of someone who had been present when it was developed. Earl Harper explained the document registered at the clerk's office. In the end, there was silence. Then one of the farmers from the most distant community raised his hand. "How long does it take to see results in our reservoir?" he asked. "It depends on the soil," said Sarah. "But it's worth trying." "How long did it take you here?" he asked. Sarah looked around. At the reservoir covered in white, at Owen, at Mr. Otis Thompson standing a bit behind with his arms no longer crossed but at his sides, at James Thompson, who had arrived without her noticing and was leaning against the fence with Caleb on his shoulder. 3 months to cover everything, she said, and 5 years of a whole life preparing without knowing it. The man nodded. That day the work multiplied across 5 communities. The months that followed were unlike anything that region had experienced in the years of drought. It wasn't that the problem disappeared. The dry spell continued, the water remained scarce, the hardships stayed real, but there was something different in the air of those communities, a change that wasn't measured in liters of water, but in how people met in the morning, in how conversations at the general stores shifted in tone, in how the children who had left for the city received messages saying there was something happening back home. Agricultural technicians from larger towns began to show up, not because anyone had asked, because the reports had reached them through channels that Sarah didn't even know existed. One of them was young, with instruments she had never seen, and he spent 2 whole days measuring, recording, photographing. In the end, he sat down beside her on the edge of the reservoir and said, with an honesty she respected, "This shouldn't be working this well. The theory is solid, but the results I'm measuring here are above what the models predict." "Why do you think that is?" she asked. He thought for a moment. "The soil here has specific characteristics. The clay composition, the depth of the water table." He paused. "It seems your grandfather chose this place on purpose to develop the method. It wasn't random." Sarah looked out at the reservoir. "No," she said, "he never did anything without a reason." The technician left a report with her before he left. It was full of terms she needed Owen to understand, but the conclusion was clear. Arthur Mitchell's method was producing measurable, sustained moisture recovery in the treated soil. It was real. It was documented. It was proven. Sarah put the report inside the tin box next to her grandfather's notes. It was that week that Mr. Otis Thompson came to her. He didn't go to the reservoir. He came to her house, knocked on the front door, something he rarely did because the usual dynamic was her going to his house. She opened the door and saw him there, hat in hand, arms uncrossed, with an expression she had never seen on him before. "May I come in?" he said. "Yes," she said, opening the door. He came in, sat in the chair she indicated, and stared at the hat in his hands for a moment. Sarah sat across from him, waiting. "I should have listened to you from the start," he said at last. His voice came out rougher than usual, as if the words had waited too long to come out. "I didn't listen because—" He stopped. "Because it was easier to think you were wrong. Because if you were right, I'd have to admit I stood by with my arms crossed when I should have rolled up my sleeves. Sarah stayed quiet. And because my father-in-law had the same ideas, and I never listened to him either, Mr. Otis Thompson continued, and my father-in-law passed away, taking the ideas with him, and when I saw you doing the same thing, I saw him in you, and I was wrong with him too. There was something so honest about that moment that Sarah felt a lump in her throat. Mr. Otis, she said carefully, nobody has to get everything right from the start. But I made you suffer more than you had to, he said bluntly. With the looks, with the silence, with standing on the sidelines without helping. I know the folks in town looked to me to know what to think, and I stood there with my arms crossed. You showed up, she said, with the paintbrush in your hand. Without saying a word, without apologizing first, you just showed up and started helping. I'll never forget that. Mr. Otis Thompson's eyes grew misty. He lowered his head for a moment, and she saw his shoulders tremble slightly. It was the first time in many years, she learned later, that that man had cried in front of anyone. She gently placed her hand on his arm. They sat there in silence for a while. When he left, hat back on his head and shoulders straighter than they had been in a long time, James was at the window and had accidentally seen part of the scene. He stood watching his father cross the yard, and there was an expression on his face that wasn't entirely joy, but was close to it. It was the expression of someone seeing two things come together that had been apart for too long. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, feel free to leave a like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot who are just starting out, now continuing. The months that followed were slow in the way hope usually is when it hasn't yet arrived. The moisture in the soil kept increasing, but slowly. The visible level hadn't changed. The bottom of the reservoir remained dry from a distance. The people who had started painting in the other communities needed constant encouragement because it's hard to keep doing something when the result isn't yet visible to the naked eye. Sarah went to the other communities 3 times during that period, not to give speeches, to paint alongside those who were painting, to probe the soil with a wooden rod beside those who were testing it, to show through gestures what words cannot accomplish. Owen accompanied her all 3 times. He had given up on the idea of returning to the city to resume his studies, at least for now. His father had recovered from his illness but needed company, and there was something happening there that he felt was bigger than anything he would find going back. He told Sarah this one afternoon without drama, just as a fact. You could be in a better place, and she said, I don't know if better is the word, he replied. More different maybe, but not better. She didn't answer, but she held on to that. The tension with Sterling hadn't disappeared. It had cooled off, but Sarah knew it wasn't over. He was the kind of man who waited for the right moment, not the kind who gave up. And the right moment for him would be when the community situation became desperate again. That's why she went to speak with Justin again. My grandfather's document protects the lands where the method was developed, she said. But what about the other communities? Their reservoirs, Justin thought. Technically, if you taught them the method and the original registration was filed by your grandfather as a community project, there's an argument to extend the protection. But you'd need a supplementary record. How do we do that? She asked. Each community would have to make its own record, a simple term signed by the farmers, linking the technique to Arthur Mitchell's original project and the community use of the land. Can you help draft it? Justin helped. In the following weeks, 5 communities signed simple terms, drafted in clear language, recording the use of the technique as a community project. They weren't perfect documents from a legal standpoint, but they were real documents, signed, dated, with witnesses. And they were enough to complicate any attempt at a land purchase made under cover of darkness. When Grant found out, through the usual channels, he went to Sterling with the news. Sterling listened without showing much. The woman is building a paper wall, he said. It seems so. Paper doesn't hold water, said Sterling. No, but it holds up lawyers, replied Grant, who at that moment had the feeling he'd said the wrong thing. But Sterling didn't react with anger. He was silent for a while. Let it be, he said finally. Time will take care of it. Time was taking care of it, but not in the way Sterling imagined. 14 months after the start of the project, a technician from an agricultural research institution in a big city arrived in the area. He had heard about what was happening through a colleague who had read the report from the young technician who had visited months earlier. He stayed for an entire week, measuring, documenting, talking to Sarah, to Owen, to Silas, to Mr. Otis Thompson. On the last day, he sat down with Sarah and said something that took her a while to process. What's happening here is significant. The rate of moisture recovery in this soil, with the technique you've applied, is above any data we have from similar interventions in Badlands soils. This needs to be studied more deeply, and it will be. He paused. Your grandfather's name will appear in that study, because the method is his. Sarah stared at him for a moment. My grandfather used to say he didn't want credit, she said. He wanted it to work. Both things can happen, the technician said with a smile. When he left, Silas was waiting at the exit. The two talked for a while, the technician with his notepad, the old man with the slow voice of someone who holds the history of people most have forgotten. After he left, Silas went back to Sarah. He asked me about Arthur, said the old man. I told him what I could. Pause. Your grandfather would be glad to know that someone finally asked. Sarah swallowed hard. When the news reached Sterling, this time he stood still for a long while. Research, he said in a low voice. Yes, said Grant, and a publication. The region's name is going to appear. Sterling was silent. The publication, when it came out months later, mentioned the farming community of the area and Arthur Mitchell's technique. It wasn't a famous publication, but it was real, circulating among technicians and researchers, and it put a name on the map of those working with semi-arid soil recovery. Sterling closed his computer and stared out the window for a long time. The land here is going to go up in value anyway, he said finally, and now it goes up for a different reason. He paused. We changed the strategy. Instead of buying before the drought ends, we buy afterward, when they need money to expand the project. Grant took notes without commenting, but that strategy was never carried out because the drought ended before Sterling could reorganize his plans. It didn't happen all at once. The rain didn't arrive like those dramatic rains that seem like redemption. It came like the beginning of a conversation, slowly, some days yes, some days no, first as a mist that wet more than it seemed, then as afternoon drizzles that the children ran out to play in, then as real rain one night in March. Sarah was sleeping when she heard the noise on the roof. She lay still, listening for a moment before she dared to believe it. James woke up beside her. Is it rain? He said, still half asleep. It is, she said. They both lay still in the dark, listening. Then she got up, crossed the room, opened the door, and stood on the threshold with her face lifted to the wet night. The rain hit her face, her shoulders, her hands, which she spread out to her sides. It was warm, as it usually is in the Badlands when it finally decides to show up. James stood behind her with his hand on her shoulder. The children appeared at the door after a while, with sleepy eyes, and Caleb asked what that was. Sarah crouched down in front of her son. It's rain, my son, she said. Why are you crying? He asked. She hadn't noticed she was. Because we've been waiting for a long time, she said. The next morning it rained more, and then more. After 4 consecutive days of sparse but steady rain, the bottom of the reservoir changed. The water began to appear at the edges first. It wasn't much. It was a thin film, almost invisible, that pooled in the lowest part of the bottom. But it was there, and around the area that had been painted white, the water pooled faster than in other parts, because the soil there had retained more moisture in the deeper layers during the months of drought, and now it received the rain in ground that still knew how to hold it. Owen was the first to see it. He ran to Sarah's house, woke her up at 6 in the morning, and when she got to the reservoir she saw it. She stood at the edge, her feet in the mud that was beginning to appear, and she looked. There was water at the bottom of the reservoir. Not much, but there was. She said nothing for a long time. She just stood there looking. Owen was beside her, also silent. Then, behind them, they heard footsteps. It was Mr. Otis Thompson, who had woken up to the commotion and was coming down the slope slowly, with his usual hat and gait. He stopped beside her. He looked at the reservoir. The three of them stood in silence for a time that no one measured. Then Mr. Otis Thompson raised his hand and placed it on Sarah's shoulder. She felt the weight of that large, calloused hand, the hand of a man who had spent his whole life on that land and who, for too long a moment, had almost lost faith in it. "Your grandfather knew what he was doing," he said, his voice hoarse from holding back pride for too long. "And so did you, from the very beginning." She didn't answer with words. She didn't need to. She took his hand with both of hers, still stained with lime, the same hands that had once painted the cracked ground while everyone laughed and squeezed. He let her. The rain returned that afternoon, and the next afternoon, and at the reservoir that had been worked on for over a year with old brushes, leaky basins and hands that never stopped, the water rose slowly, with the patience of things that arrive at the right time because they were prepared with care. In the 5 years that followed, the reservoir filled completely. It wasn't a straight line. There were better years and worse years. There were months when the rain disappeared again, and the fear returned with it. But the treated soil had changed its ability to hold and receive water, and that didn't undo itself with one dry month. The children from neighboring communities grew up hearing the story of the woman who had painted the ground white while everyone laughed. Some thought it was an exaggeration. The older ones knew it wasn't. Owen stayed. He resumed his studies by correspondence, finished his agronomy degree, and became the technical reference for the project that had started without a name or a plan one November morning with 2 buckets and a worn-out brush. He never married Sarah, nor was that ever the intention, but between them there was the kind of friendship that only grows between people who knelt on the same ground when there was no certainty it was worth it. Silas lived to be 81. In his final years, when his legs could no longer manage the slope, he would sit on the porch and ask someone to tell him how the reservoir was. When the reservoir finally filled completely, Sarah went to him and described it in detail. The old man was quiet for a while, then said, "Arthur knew, the man always knew." Mr. Otis Thompson kept painting, even after there was no more soil to paint. He painted the fence, the water tank, the shed wall. James said his father had found something in the act of painting that he didn't know he needed. The old man never explained, but he would take off his hat when he painted, something he never did in any other context, and that said more than any explanation. James and Sarah stayed on that land. It wasn't always easy. There was a dry season that returned and tested them again. There were fights, heavy silences, nights of doubt. But between them, there was a foundation that had been built precisely in the worst moments, when he had truly listened to her, and when she had waited for him without giving up, and that foundation held the weight of difficult things. Caleb grew up wanting to be an agricultural technician. Daisy wanted to paint, but pictures, not reservoirs, which made her mother laugh with the kind of joy that only appears when life didn't turn out exactly as planned, but turned out better than the plan. Mr. Sterling Vance tried one last time, 6 years after everything, with a different proposal. Now he wanted to become a formal partner in the soil restoration project, with a financial stake and his name attached to it. Sarah received him in person for the first and only time on a September afternoon. He was an older man than she had imagined, with white hair and a suit that seemed out of place in the heat of the Badlands. She received him at the full reservoir, in the same place where she had knelt with the brush on a morning when everyone laughed. She listened to the entire proposal. Then she was silent for a moment. "You're too late," she said without anger. "The project doesn't need a partner. The project has what it needs." He looked at the full reservoir for a moment. "I was wrong," he said, and seemed genuine, which surprised her. "You were," she agreed, "but the reservoir filled anyway." He left without signing anything and without an accepted proposal. And there was something in his posture as he climbed the slope that Sarah hadn't expected. The posture of someone who had lost, but who had lost to something you can't hate. She stayed at the edge of the reservoir after he left. She looked at the water. Within it lay the work of many hands, many brushes, many early mornings and many nights of doubt. There was the method of Grandfather Arthur, who had waited 40 years to be proven right. There was the stubbornness of a woman with curly hair and calloused hands, who had knelt on the cracked ground when no one believed. And there, at the bottom of that water, was the answer to the question everyone had mockingly asked 3 years before, calling her the painter of the Badlands. The answer was simple. The answer was full. And there it was, reflecting the sky. End of the story. Now tell us what you thought of this story. Do you believe Sarah's stubbornness was worth it? Leave it in the comments. Tell us where you're watching from, leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories.